My name is Marc Anderson. We're going to talk a little bit about building solutions in SharePoint with KnockoutJS. If you were in my session yesterday, and I recognize a few faces, you saw a few of the things that I was going to show today. So now you'll see how it actually works beyond just how I would go out and get the data. So I guess I'll just jump into the introduction. So who am I? I'm a consultant. I live in Boston in the US. I have my own little company. I pretty much do SharePoint, and then when I'm not doing SharePoint, I do SharePoint for fun. It's my hobby, my vocation. It's a lot of fun, and I actually really enjoy what I do. I wrote SPServices, which is a library that some of you I know use. And how many of you have used SPServices before? Cool, awesome. Nice to see that it's helping people out. I've been an MVP for 5 years now, so that's quite an honor. And the best thing about it is the company that I get to keep. A lot of very, very smart people to talk to and bounce ideas off of. Contact info there in the slide deck if you need it. I won't read through any of that. I've written some books, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so what I want to talk about is building things with KnockoutJS. Now, you've probably seen a lot more about people using Angular than Knockout. I think that some of this is just fashion. You know, what do people, you know, everyone sort of migrates to the same thing as opposed to the thing that works for what they're doing. So, you know, I would encourage you, if you're thinking about using some of these frameworks, to look at, you know, what they actually do and what you're trying to accomplish. You know, matching the business requirements to the tools, sort of a wacko concept. People are always asking me, what tool should I use Angular or Knockout? And I say, I don't know. I mean, what are you trying to do? That's not the question, right? So that said, we have a lot of options, and those are just two of the frameworks that are out there. We have a lot of options to build client-side applications now that weren't there just a couple of years ago. So a lot of the things that we've been sort of rolling on our own, and I'll show you an example of how I used to do things and now how I'm doing the same thing with Knockout. We're able to do a lot better development, a lot more robust development. I use robust too much probably, but we should always be trying to move towards something that's more powerful and more maintainable as the market matures around JavaScript and things like that. So JavaScript is no longer a kid's toy. It's not your grandfather's JavaScript. It's not stupid. It's not code. I've been saying all this for years, but now I think most people sort of agree with me. I know that Andrew Connell has taken on AngularJS as his primary development tool, that probably it's okay now, you know, that to talk about JavaScript as being very cool. So the other nice thing about this is it doesn't matter what version of SharePoint you're in. So I know we have one SharePoint 2007 here. How many people are on 2007? Cool. All right, so you can do all of this. There's nothing to stop you from building very powerful client-side tool applications using these tools today. How about 2010? Okay, good. It's usually the majority. 2013 on-premises, and then on Office 365. Okay, cool. So we have a good mix, and all of these methods work exactly the same way no matter where you are. I've actually lifted up most of this code and moved it from version to version by copying the files. That's how hard it is to redeploy. So that's good news for anybody who's on an older version and is going to move to a newer version, et cetera. Okay, so what is Knockout? It's a JavaScript framework. You hear these words kicked around all the time: frameworks, plugins. Yeah, you can probably toss out a couple other names. These words tend to get used rather interchangeably. They don't really matter. I mean, I think that basically these things are libraries, another word. They're libraries of functions that you can call using JavaScript that let you do things in a more high-level way, okay? Knockout is usually referred to as a framework. It's free and open source, woohoo, right? So we can all use it. There's nothing to stop us. There's no price barrier here. Open source does not mean free. I know that because I maintain an open source library. It's not free to keep it working, and it's not free to use it, in the sense that you still have to work, okay? There's this misconception about open source that says, I'll just download it and I'll all of a sudden have these applications. Well, you're still going to have to do some work, right? And that's the third bullet here, is there is a learning curve. I've been working with Knockout for probably about maybe a year and a half, maybe not quite that long. And I still am learning how to do things better. So as with anything, you're going to jump in and you're going to have to get up to speed. And you'll get better and better, and you'll come up with different development patterns that work well for your organization. So it's a thing that, just like jQuery, just like SPServices, just like any other plugin, a slider that you go and you grab that does something cool, or any other plugin that you get that might add some UI pizzazz to your applications, you're still going to have to figure out how it works. So, don't expect that it's going to be very, very quick and easy, though you can get up and running pretty fast if you follow some of the good tutorials that are out there. The Knockout site is actually very good. There's good community support. There are enough people using Knockout that, Stack Exchange has a lot of questions about it. There's some bloggers who write about it all the time. I'll give you some links at the end. So there's enough critical mass around it that it's not just some little side thing that doesn't get a lot of attention. So you'll find a lot of good writing about it out there. So that's important. I mean, that's one of the things that I use to evaluate a plugin or a library or something. When I look for something new, is can I tell that people are using it? Or a lot of people asking dumb questions about it? Because if that's the case, then everyone's going through the learning curve, and we can all move together. That's a good thing. So the key things that Knockout gives us is, and I think the most important thing, is this sort of declarative bindings concept. What we can do with Knockout is we can build our HTML and our JavaScript and really keep them separate. If you've been using SPServices or you've been writing client-side code for a while, your JavaScript and your HTML have sort of been like this, most likely, right? You've been creating strings in your JavaScript that you then stuff into the DOM that get the data into the page, right? So with Knockout, we start to really separate those two concerns, and that's a really great way to move your development forward, because you can have different people working on the different pieces. That's one piece, if your team is bigger, and you also I think have more maintainable code. You're maintaining the HTML and the JavaScript separately, so you can add business logic to your JavaScript without ever changing the display mechanisms. When you have it like this, that gets trickier, and that's the way I was doing things for years. So I know of which I speak. Automatic UI refresh, because there's the concept of an observable. An observable is a value that you declare something as an observable, and basically what you're saying is, if this value changes, then go and redo all of the things that depend upon it. Okay, so if you have an observable that just has a value of true or false, and over here in your HTML you say turn something red if it's true. Well, if that value changes, this automatically turns red. You don't have to do anything. So that's part of the real magic around what Knockout does for you. So you don't have to wire up all that stuff that you've had to do manually if you've been rolling your own. That dependency tracking is what sort of feeds that. You can have lots of more complex dependencies. You can subscribe to events. You can sort of get into advanced topics. I won't go too far into some of that advanced stuff today. And then the concept of templating. Again, JavaScript and templating, the HTML is separate. You actually keep it in a separate file so that you can really maintain it a lot more better. So why do we care? This is something that a lot of people don't realize, but the way I think of it is, once the page is in the browser, it's ours. It's not SharePoint's anymore. We can do anything we want in it. So SharePoint delivers us something with a lot of data in it, sort of a Chrome and usually a bunch of web parts and stuff. But that's the DOM that we start working on. In fact, SharePoint has really a lot of JavaScript on the Office 365 level, and even back to SharePoint 2003, it was full of JavaScript. And SharePoint itself has got things going on. We hover over things, we click on a menu. JavaScript drives a lot of that. But once it's in the browser, we really own it. We can take web parts out, we can add new web parts, we can do whatever we want. We're just not doing anything on the server, right? So we can build anything, we just have to have the data. We do have to have the data, so that's a bit of a hurdle. But if it's out there somewhere in SharePoint or anywhere else that we can reach through Ajax or some other mechanism, then we can build an application around it. Data binding really saves us a lot of work. You know, when somebody says, well, yeah, but could you move it over here? It's so often just a copy and paste of the HTML as opposed to a rewrite of your JavaScript. So it saves us a lot of time and a lot of effort. When values change, we don't have to do a lot of JavaScript to make that happen. And then once you've gotten there, once you've sort of gotten up to this higher level of foundation, making changes is a lot easier. Okay, so I will tell you that starting an application with Knockout rather than rolling your own may take you longer to get to, okay, here's something that you can look at. You know, here, Mr. User, here's my first pass at it. It might take you a little bit longer, but then when they start to react to it, you'll be able to move forward faster. So it's a little bit of a steeper cliff to get up to the top of, but I think, not horribly, but I think it's worth it because you get a lot better maintainability going forward. So how does it compare to some other approaches or frameworks? If you roll your own, like, as I said, we don't have that separation of concerns, and I'll show you an example of exactly what I mean by that. Knockout gives us data binding, templating. We can build single-page applications. The way I think about that is that it's really like a single page, okay? Like you don't go anywhere from that particular page. Whereas Angular does true single-page applications because it adds the concept of routing. Your URLs might have something like /15, which would be show me item number 15, that routing concept. And you see this on websites. You probably just don't watch the URLs too much. That concept of routing means that you can have very deep single-page applications, whereas with Knockout, I tend to build this page, and I might send the user to another page that has another Knockout capability on it. So there's single-page applications built around a set of functions as opposed to a deep page that has all that functionality built into one. Again, it's going to depend on what kinds of things you want to build. If you wanted to build something like, you know, those little surveys that are often on the homepage of an intranet, you know, here are 3 choices, you click one, and then you see the little graph that shows the results for everybody. That's a great example of something that Knockout would be very good at. Angular would be almost real overkill for that. So for some of these simpler things, I think Knockout is sort of a no-brainer, better way to go. You could certainly do it just sort of rolling it yourself and building it without too much trouble. But Knockout gives you something that's a little more reusable. Angular's too much. So as applications get more complex, Angular may make more sense. I think Knockout is a very square in the middle, a big range of the middle of the spectrum. So the high level of functionality with SharePoint, sort of the pattern that I've come up with as I've been building applications with it for a while, I end up with these different sort of chunks of code or markup. We have to have some sort of data access, right? When the page loads, we usually go out and we get some data. Either that or we decide that we want to load the data in the page, you know, but usually we're going to go out with Ajax, SPServices, REST, CSOM, however we want to do it, and grab some data. Then we have some logic that runs when the document is ready, just like we do with most stuff that we do with jQuery. Until the markup from the page is actually in the browser, we can't really do much until we can't put things into the page or change the behavior of things that are already in the page because it's not there yet. We have some sort of application logic, you know, if this value turns to true, then let's make that section of the HTML red or whatever it is. We have a view model, which sort of drives all of this. This is where those observables live. This is where Knockout really does all of its magic. If you're used to doing MVM or MVVM or all these other acronyms that confuse the hell out of me, then that makes sense to you, right? We have templates, HTML with the data binding, and then we have CSS. So as client-side developers, we have to understand CSS. CSS becomes a big part of our development toolkit. So if you're coming from the server side and you've been poo-pooing CSS for years, you can't do that anymore. You have to learn how to do stuff with CSS. So these things sort of break out into these components, if you will. So we have the three things that are really just JavaScript, or the data access, some sort of initial manipulation of that data. Usually we're going to be pulling data from lists, and we might want to manipulate that data a little bit so that it's more usable for our view model. So for instance, if I'm pulling data from 3 lists and I want to combine them into a more complex JavaScript object, I might do that up front. And I can do that before the page loads because I know I need the data, but I don't have to wait for the page to be there for that work to happen. So while the page is loading, I'm busily manipulating that data. The view model, again, is what really drives the functionality of the page, and then once the document is ready, I sort of fire everything off. And I'll show you how all this works in several different examples. The HTML is the templates, and then the CSS for the application styling. You'll want to get very familiar with the concept of adding and subtracting classes. If you've been doing work with jQuery, you understand how that works. Add class, remove class. It works differently in Knockout. We're sort of applying or not applying a CSS value. I actually will show you how that works. But you want to, as much as possible, be adding and removing classes as opposed to manipulating CSS directly. It's sort of like the difference between doing inline CSS, which SharePoint does a lot of and drives us all crazy, right? Sometimes we'll see in SharePoint's markup style, width equals 30 pixels or something, and it's hard to override that because it's inline, and then we find ourselves using bang important evil. Don't do that if we can avoid it, right? So we want to use classes as much as possible. Data sources, I sort of mentioned this already. It doesn't really matter what we use. We're going to want to get some data in most cases to manipulate in the page. These are some of those links that I just keep going back to over and over and over again. There aren't a lot of them, but one of the things that you end up doing a lot with, especially with the list-based data that we have in SharePoint, is you'll get these slides, by the way, if you're taking pictures of the screen. We work with observable arrays a lot because we're getting a bunch of items from a list, and we load them into an observable array, okay? Observable arrays are a thing that you really have to get your head around if you're working on Knockout. So these links are all about observable arrays and sort of some of the tricks that you can use to manipulate them and work with them. This guy, if you see his name anywhere, and I don't know how he has as much time as he does because he's everywhere. But if you see that guy's name on a comment or a post or anything, it's golden. I don't think he's on the Knockout team. I don't really understand who he is, but he must be up 23 hours a day working with Knockout. So if you see that guy's name, that's good stuff. I look for him when sometimes you'll be on Stack Exchange and you'll see a bunch of sort of weird answers, and then you'll see his name, and it sometimes doesn't get pushed up to the top, but it should. That's the answer you want, okay? All right, so enough of this slide stuff. Let me show you some examples. So let me start with something very simple, not that one. Okay, so this is a really simple little, it's barely even an application I built to talk about single page applications in a different session. So I have 2 versions of it. This is sort of the old-fashioned roll your own version, and this is the Knockout version. And other than not handling the time zone very well, it works great when I'm sitting in Boston. These 2 are exactly the same, right? You really see exactly the same data, right? So let me hop over into my favorite development tool, SharePoint Designer. Not that one, the blue one. Okay. And we're going to look at this. Okay, so what's the difference? So this is the way I used to build applications. So I have a little HTML file that I load in a content editor web part. You're all familiar with how to do that. I load a couple of libraries. I'm loading jQuery. I'm loading SPServices. I'm loading Moment.js. How many people use Moment.js? If you don't have that as part of your toolkit, you should absolutely. Don't do date and time arithmetic or manipulation ever again. Let Moment.js do it for you. It's very, very cool. That should always be on your list of loads. And then I have some CSS for this application, just specific to the application, and I have some JavaScript specific to the application. And then I just load a div, or put a div into the DOM, right? So that's my basic load structure. I load a bunch of libraries, and there may be some more in there depending on what I'm doing. And then I have the application-specific stuff. So again, this is the old way of doing it. There's no knockout in this, right? And then the JavaScript for this looks, you know, I'm not embarrassed by it, but it's sort of my old way of doing things. And you see a lot of things like this. Can you see that all right? No, you probably can't. You guys in the front can see it. So it's things like I'm building a string called out, and I'm putting a table in it, right? You've all done this, right? And I'm putting some data into it by calling a function there, and then I poke the HTML into my, my container, right? And that line is not particularly horrible, but then you get to things like where I'm actually building the markup for a specific item, and you can see what we're doing here. We're building these strings, and we're doing it in a rather complex way, right? It works. There's nothing wrong with that, but this is the main thing that Knockout really starts to help out with. We've got our JavaScript and our HTML together here, right? So all the manipulation happens in this one particular place. So we can't have a, so say a designer hands us you know, a bunch of markup as part of a design. We have to do this to it. We sort of have to inject all of our JavaScript into that design in order to make it work, right? You probably have done this, or at least you've sketched out the markup that you want. I don't usually do it this way. I just sort of like go at it. I'm not very organized in some ways. But you know, you actually have to merge the JavaScript and the HTML together because you don't usually get both from the designer if there is one, right? So works fine. That's probably the way you've been doing things if you haven't used something like Knockout. With Knockout, we have a little bit of a different load structure. So all the same, this is the same version of the page, but with Knockout, right? So I'm loading all the same libraries, right? Nothing really all that different except Knockout's in there, right? Up here. And then I have my HTML template, or the sort of the container with all of the templated markup in it. So rather than building that table in my JavaScript, I have it here, right? And you notice there's no data in here because I don't even know what the data is yet, right? But I have something here. The table body has a data bind. So anything in HTML5 that where you add an attribute should start with data dash, right? So that's an HTML5 construct, and then you can have any word after that you want. In this case, we're doing a data bind that means something to Knockout. When we activate Knockout on the page, it looks for that and does things with whatever's in those attributes, okay? So here I'm saying let's use the template with the name of pledge. These are pledges from a fund drive. And for each of the pledges, I'm going to run through and iterate that, okay? So it's sort of what I'm doing in my JavaScript, but it's separated from the application logic. And then here's each pledge. So these are the values that I was sort of gluing together in the strings in the old way of doing it. So every place I've got a data bind here, Knockout's going to look at it and say, okay, well, what do you want me to do here, right? So I'm saying I want the text to be the first name plus a space plus the last name with the first character of the last name. So I'm building a little bit of application logic in here. If I were really strict about it, I could put all of that logic into my JavaScript instead. and just keep the two very separate. I could just do text and call it display name or something and do that calculation in the JavaScript. So you can decide how strict you want to be, but you can really separate those two things. This was just a quick demo that I knocked together, so I didn't necessarily stick to all of the best practices. But that's the basic difference. Does that sort of get across how the different approaches work? Okay. So that little application is really not very interesting. It doesn't do a lot of really cool stuff, but where's my, I love it when I switch screen resolution because I never can find anything. So all this really does is, like, if I click the Assign to Me button, it actually writes my name back into that particular pledge, assigns it to me, and then changes the value in the display. So again, nothing fancy, but there's a little bit of back and forth there. It's a real application from that perspective. Knockout helps with that, because if I poke my name into that array of pledges, it updates the, am I in the Knockout one? Nope, I'm on the other one. If I click it here, Knockout handles the update of the display. I don't have to do that. I don't have to build the logic to do that. I just change the value in the array of pledges. Okay? So that's part of the real power of it. I still have to write the value out to the list. Knockout doesn't understand SharePoint any better than anything else does, including us, right? But it does help a lot with managing the display. Okay, so that's a very simple example. So let's look at a more complex example. This is the one that I was showing in my session yesterday. So if you were there yesterday, you saw this a little bit. So the idea here, this is a real prototype that I and a colleague named Marcel Meth, whose name is on here somewhere. Yep, we're building for the Charlotte Airport. They have SharePoint. They've been using it for a lot of sort of basic document management kind of stuff. All the sort of level 1 SharePoint things, and if you think about the SharePoint maturity scale, they're not using it for anything all that fancy. But they're starting to think about how to use it as a platform to manage more of their business. So this is just a prototype, but it's actually it's a working prototype. It uses Knockout. It's pulling real data out of real lists. It lets you do some real things. So I thought it actually, since I've been building it recently, I'm really familiar with it, and I thought it was actually a pretty good demo. So the idea here is it's a procurement system, right? So people make requests. I always have to wonder whether I'm using the words that mean something in England, but in the US we call it procurement sometimes we call it purchasing. So I might want to buy some new vending machines, so I put in a request for that. Actually David did, and so the development department needs some new vending machines, right? There are a couple of workflows that run in the background. Once that request is saved, a couple of workflows run and generate some tasks. This is fairly standard SharePoint stuff, right? It needs to be approved, and then there are a couple of sign-offs that happen in parallel. So it's a 2 or 3 stage workflow. It's nothing fancy, but it's a fairly typical thing that we might do in SharePoint. So what we see here is all of the requests that are outstanding in the system. And again, it's a demo, or a prototype, so there's not a lot of data right now. The business logic that's built in here is very light. But we can do some really nice stuff, like we can do a new request, sort of standard SharePoint thing, but I'm doing this from JavaScript. We're using an info path form. I won't go through saving one of these because it's not all that interesting, but again, prototype, so we're going to collect a bunch of data. Those workflows will kick off, and we'll end up with something like this. Once the workflow runs, there's a task for somebody, all right? So part of the problem with a lot of procurement pathways is that we don't know who's holding what up, right? I mean, we know we made the request, but where is it, right? And one of the problems with SharePoint workflows is that all that data is there, but it's hidden back in workflow statuses, right? So all we're doing here is we're getting the requests from the request list. We're getting the tasks from the workflow task list that match that request. And then we're showing, in this case, contracts that will come out of that process. So those are, each one of those sections is coming from a different list. And that's that data manipulation idea that I was talking about up front. Sort of do that before the page loads. I can also do some things in this page, some of the simple things that I as a user would want to do. So I can do things like look at my requests. So this is something that I asked for, right? So, you know, where is it? What's going on? Well, Marcel hasn't approved that one yet. I can see right here, he hasn't approved it. If I look at all the requests again, you can see I'm just mimicking what happens with SharePoint's task management here. If I uncheck that box, the strike through goes away, and you'll notice that because today is the 21st, I think, right? The date turns red. So those are the things that are actually running late, okay? And this is writing the value back. It's marking that as a 100% complete task. We can add more functionality here. The idea here is that it may not be a single page application, but the goal is to have it be sort of a dashboard where people can do, you know, 80 or 90% of what they need to do for this process right here without leaving. I could look for tasks that are in a particular department, and you notice how fast that is. There's no post back here. That's just manipulating the data on the client side. I'm just filtering that array, and then Knockout magically shows the stuff that is part of that filtered array. Pretty cool, right? And these are actually, and one of the other cool things, anybody use Quickbooks Online? No. Oh, well, this probably really looks cool to you then, because I totally stole it from there. So the idea here is that we're just showing open, in progress, and closed requests, right? Based on what's going on with the tasks, right? So I think, yeah, so obviously it's not as responsive as it should be. In a real resolution screen, this looks beautiful. So you notice that yellow bar got a little smaller. If I check that box, it's showing me the status overall of everything that's in that view. It's pretty nice, huh? So, you know, the manager of procurement or something could come and say, yeah, my people are not doing their job. So we all get a view that really helps. But how does that work, right? And there I want to go to this. Okay, so this is all I'm loading in the page. I'm using require.js. I'm not going to talk about that too much today, but one of the nice things about, has anyone used require.js? Yeah? Okay. It helps you load things into the page, mainly JavaScript, though you can use it for other things too, that are required as opposed to having to load everything up front. Again, I won't get into the details of that, but you'll see sort of a wrapper of require.js stuff on this. So this is all I'm putting into the page. So content editor web part, drop this HTML into it, and we're up and running, right? And what that script tag does is actually fire off require.js and say, grab procurement app setup.js and get things rolling, okay? So app setup. That app setup JavaScript looks like this. So how many people use strict in their JavaScript? Turn it on and then really hate yourself. It helps you catch some of the basic errors. You'll find that when you turn on use strict, you'll start to get more errors in your browser. But the reason those errors are firing, you know, that's a good thing. It starts to tell you things like you've declared a variable that isn't, that's going into the global scope. So it starts to catch some things that really are bad practice. So you should look at how use strict works. So here I'm creating an application namespace, right? So this is for Charlotte Airport. This airport's 3-character code is CLT, so that's my namespace. This is a function I use to load CSS, mainly used by the require.js stuff. So I'll sort of skip through the require.js part, but you'll see that I'm loading jQuery, SPServices, Knockout, Moment.js, all the same stuff that I was loading in that other thing. And I'm also loading a data access JS file and an application JS file. So I'm doing that in using require.js, but it's basically the same idea I had in that other simpler application, right? And once things are sort of loading, I go and I grab some data. So I'm getting from the request, or I'm sorry, I actually have a configuration file here. And this is a pattern that I've started to follow, is that I actually put a list into the site that lets me store some configuration options. So you'll see, this is actually the title, parameter name, parameter value. So just name value pairs. Any place I start to feel like I want to type a literal value, in quotes, I put it in the config list instead, because I want to, as much as possible, get myself out of the business of changing this application once it's delivered, right? I don't want my clients to call me back to change this value, right? Like, oh, we have a different list, so we need you to recode it. No. Just go change the value in this list, right? So anything that's a parameter, I try to put in there, okay? Not a lot in this one yet, but I also have a versioning concept that I use around these applications, so I can move from version to version by just sort of cloning into different folders and having different versions of the code. So that's the configuration file. So I load that, and when it's done, I do some manipulation of that. I load some CSS here. Again, because I'm using required.js, it looks a little bit different, but you know what loading CSS looks like. And then finally, I launch the application. So this is sort of the meat of the thing. So I've abstracted my data access requests, or my data access calls. They're stored in a different file. I talked about this yesterday in my session. As we're starting to move from SOAP to REST, if you're still using SPServices, abstracting out your, so here's the Charlotte requests read all function. If I start to abstract this out, then I can make a simple call like that to get all of the data. And it doesn't matter what happens in that function. I can switch from SOAP to REST over time, or whatever, CSOM. As long as I hand back the data. That's the point, right? So here's where I get the data from the three data sources: requests, tasks, and contracts, like we saw on the screen. If I wanted to do any sort of pre-processing based on what the configuration told me, I would do it there. In this case, I'm not doing anything. When the document's ready, I set up the view model. So the view model is just a function, okay? And there's some conventions to this. So if you've done a lot of JavaScript programming, you know that this is a common term, and this is confusing. Sometimes this is not this, it's that, right? So one of the things that you'll see in almost all of the examples of Knockout is that we set self equals this, just to give ourselves a little bit more of a clear idea of what's going on. Because once you get into a loop or something, this is a different this is that. It's wonderful in JavaScript that we can say this, but you really can confuse the hell out of yourself. So we use self in most of the examples of Knockout. You'll see that. And I'm just going to hide this sidebar. Is that better? Yeah. Is that big enough for the back? In the back? Okay. So what we do is we start to set up things like observable variables. So self.initialized. Have I initialized the page yet? This is a variable that I always end up setting so that once the page is initialized, I may do some different stuff, right? I may hide things until everything's initialized because the data loading may take a little time. So that's an observable. KO is knockout, right? It's a KO observable, and I set it to false. The page is not initialized yet, okay? So that's the simplest way that we can create an observable value. Now, any time later, I change that value initialized. Because it's an observable, Knockout is smart enough that it says, okay, well, what depends on initialized? I'll go and check and see if any of those need to be changed. That's what that data binding does for us. Does that make sense? It's that simple concept is really the power behind Knockout, the observable concept. I set up some other variables. You notice I have 3 observable arrays because I know I'm going to have multiple requests, multiple tasks, and multiple contracts, right? So far, not linked, right? They're just separate lists. I want to know who the current user is. I want to know what site I'm in, all that sort of stuff. I'm going to count how many requests there are. That's part of what's going to drive that colored bar at the top. I have to know how many there are in total to tell you how many, what percentage are in each bucket. How many are open? So here I'm going to do a KO computed, which means that this is going to be something that depends on another observable. Okay? So we're sort of tying the two together. It's computed based on what's in the requests array. Okay? And I'm using the KO utilities, and one of those articles that I put in the resources explains how all these utilities work. But I'm filtering the array, and I'm only finding, I won't go through all of those, but I'm trying to find things where the tasks are not all completed, right? Because that's an open request, right? It has an outstanding task, so it's not complete. Make sense? So that's just to get the count. So it's a little bit of code that sort of has to loop through some things, but it's only going to do that if I change what's in that array. Okay? So once it's calculated, if nothing changes, it doesn't have to go through this loop again. When I checked or unchecked that box, it has to recalculate this, but it does that for me. I don't once I've written the code and it's loaded in the page, I don't have to go, oh, somebody just clicked a box, so let me bind to that event and run some code. Because we're using observables, Knockout takes care of that for us. Okay? So I'm setting up a bunch of these variables. There's an in-progress count, closed request count. I have those two views, and I try to store those in an array itself, right? Because I could programmatically add another view if I wanted to, and I would just poke it into that array. Next, I have some functions where I'm loading the data. Okay, so I have the data in arrays that come back from my data access requests, but I haven't put them in the observable arrays yet, right? So I have to take that step. I may have manipulated the data when I got it, but I still have to put it into the observable array to sort of get all this magic to happen with Knockout. So that's what these three functions are for, and they're very simple. In this case, I'm not doing much when I'm pushing them into the observable arrays, but these load functions can get much more complicated. I have a filtered request array. It's a computed array, which means it depends on something else because it's about requests. It depends on the requests array. And there I'm just filtering based on which view we've chosen, right? So my filtered request gets set to something that's assigned to me, or actually, no, requested by me if I choose the my requests. If I choose all requests, it's everything, right? So again, I don't have to do anything per se when that view thing changes. I don't have to attach to the change event for that. Knockout does that for me. Okay, so we're sort of going up a couple levels of abstraction on those changes in the UI. I'm going to skip through some stuff, blah, 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 blah. So you build all this stuff, and then sort of at the bottom of your view model, you call what you actually want to happen. Okay, so I want to load the requests, I want to load the tasks, I want to load the contracts. And then I set initialize to true, because I'm done, right? That's the done squiggle, okay? So if there's anything that depends on that initialize, we don't want to do something until all the data is in those arrays. Knockout, as I'm adding the data to these arrays, Knockout is painting the page. It's putting the data into the templates. And then finally, when I've got a when here, so I've gone and I've asked for those three data sources, but I don't know for sure that they're all loaded because it may have taken a while, right? So I'm checking the promises that I've gotten from the data access methods up above, and saying, well, if those are all done, then let's actually apply the bindings. This is sort of what says to Knockout, okay, now get going. Okay, I've done all that setup, But until I do this, Knockout actually hasn't tried to do anything on the page. That apply bindings step says, okay, go to town, go find all those data binds and things that make sense to Knockout and do your thing, okay? And you just point it at an ID, and the model and the ID, and it goes to town, okay? So that's, it's not a very complicated program. Not program, do we still say program? I'm old. I'm saying punch cards, ticker tapes. So it's not a very complex or long chunk of code. You know, I mean, you can see it's 250 lines or something. There's a lot of functionality there for that much code. At least I feel like there is. It took me a day and a half to build this. So it's real. We showed it to them. Obviously, they were impressed. It's got red, green, yellow. Everyone's always impressed with that, right? If they don't use Quickbooks Online, then they're really impressed, like you guys probably are. Because I even stole the colors. It's like, you know, right click, what's that color code? Quickbooks Online shows you that with your invoices. So it's pretty nice, right? I mean, I did that in a day and a half. If you start with Knockout, it's not going to be a day and a half for you. I mean, to be honest, it might be a week, however long it's going to take. But once you're at this stage, you can do a lot of stuff very quickly. So for instance, this morning I noticed that this date was red, even though the task was complete. So I thought, well, I'm demoing this. I don't want it to look wrong, right? Why would it be red? I mean, it shouldn't be red unless somebody hasn't done something with it and it's late, right? So I went in and I looked at oh, I didn't show you this yet. So I looked at the HTML and I went down here and I said, well, you know, it's only late if, where's my due date? It's only late if it's not complete. So I added that little chunk of code, and now it only is red if somebody hasn't checked the box. Simple change, right? But that's all it took when I noticed that it was wrong. Okay? So again, higher bar to get to, but once you're there, it's a little bit smoother driving. So yeah, here are the templates, so I should really show you this, right? So this is the HTML that gets loaded into the page to drive all of that. So you saw the JavaScript side. This is the HTML side. So you can see it's fairly, how many of you have done XSL and Data View Web Parts? Isn't that the most fun? I actually sort of miss it, because that was my bread and butter for a long time. This sort of should look familiar to you from that experience, right? It's not XSL, but you're starting to do that sort of template. You've got some markup, and then you're putting, remember XSL value of. It's not that different, right? We're saying, so for instance, I've got IDs and classes and things like that, but So for instance, here on this request bar open, so this is the part of that bar on the top that's red. Okay, how many requests are open? So I say it only should be visible if it has a count, right? It shouldn't even show that red part unless there's a number of requests in there, right? I'm saying style, it's not necessarily good. But in this case, I'm doing some math, right? So the width of that bar should be 100 times the open request count over the all request count, right? So if 40% of the requests, 4 out of 10 are open, then it should be 40% of the width of the top, right? So I can do this math stuff in my markup, or I could have a function I call and pass in those two values. I can do it either way. So that calculation stuff is pretty cool. So only show it if there's a value and make it as wide as it should be, right? That's not that different than what you do in XSL, right? I mean, template and logic binding is pretty much what it is. It's the same whether you switch languages or not. So inside that bar, I have a div that gets the text of open, the string open colon, and then the open request count. Okay. So this is that top bar. So there's logic built into it, but all of the calculations and everything about how many requests are open, how many are closed, all that sort of stuff happens in my JavaScript. Here's where the logic for the view is. So this is a special data binding for selects that Knockout gives us. We pass it an array and it builds the select for us. You notice there's no actual option markup here. Knockout does it based on these settings. And it knows that because you've used that kind of a binding, that when something changes there, you're going to want something to happen. And in fact, you can specify a lot more than I do there, because you can be very specific about what happens when that thing changes. Same thing with the departments. We can build our templates in very componentized ways. Is that a word? Componentized? So here's a div where I'm going to put the requests, right? And I'm binding, you notice I'm doing app wait while it's initializing. It's actually going to show a spinner. This thing loads pretty fast. Office 365 is definitely getting faster, because my spinners always used to show for a while. Now they're not really showing at all. That's my indicator. It's actually working better. I'm going to call the template request list, and it'll end up inside that div. Okay? Here's my template with the name request list, right? So we can build our templates in these separate components. We could actually build them each in a separate file, right? And sort of yank them all in together. So again, if we wanted to separate our development out across a large number of developers, you take the request list template, I'll take the whatever template, right? Be sort of silly in this case, but you get the idea, right? So we just we can use that script tag, type equals text/HTML, and give it an ID, and Knockout knows what to do with that, okay? Because it's going to look for that template name. I'm using div-based table here. Has anyone else done that? So tables are nice. Div-based tables are also nice. Some people think tables are evil. I don't think they're evil, but in this case, because I'm actually sort of nesting a lot, I don't want to use tables. I'm trying to be modern in my markup. So I've got a header. I've got KO if the filtered request length is what that is sort of implies not 0, right? So if there are requests, then call this template, request list table body, for each filtered request. Remember I showed you the filtered requests in the JavaScript, where I'm calculating, or I'm filtering the array based on your selections at the top. If it does not have a length, then use the template empty list. Okay? The empty list template just says something like, no requests meet your criteria, right? So we can build these templates, separate templates, and conditionally load which one makes sense based on the values. So request list table body, right? So I'm going to go down to this. So this is really where I'm doing each row in that request list. So if it's an even row, it's going to get I'm doing zebra striping. I don't know if you noticed that when I was looking at the page. I'm using unordered list. Here's the title, the requested by, the department, the created. Each one's bound to some values in the request, right? The other thing that happens with that for each is it passes, much like in display templates, if you've used display templates in SharePoint, it passes the current context into that template. So I can refer to title because the context is that request, okay? It's like the CTX object in a display template. I have about 5 minutes. And so you can see I'm displaying things. I'm sort of doing a little bit of conditional logic there. I'm doing things like, if it's requested by me, which means that the current user equals the requester ID. Then I apply this class, which gives me that green thing, right? So that just shows me that that's one of my requests. So I can build a lot of logic into this by just changing those data bindings a little bit. You know, I could add another change to the CSS or something relatively quickly just by adding a little extra work and a little bit of extra logic into those data bindings. Those are all the basics of Knockout. You can go a lot further. I'm just going to, given the shortage of time here, I'm going to just quickly show you a couple of other things that I built to show you how far you can actually go with it. This is an application that's real that I've actually built for a customer, a client. And the idea here is that task management in SharePoint sort of sucks. I mean, you have the view. If you want to work with a task, you have to click on it. You go, you know, it's sort of that clunky old postback model, though it's gotten a little better with dialogues and things like that. What this is, we built this on SharePoint 2010, so it looks a little bit funny on 2013. But the idea here is that based on the tasks, we want to work the tasks that are open. It looks better on a little bit wider monitor, obviously. We want to do things like add tags to them. We want to assign them to people. I can choose people like this. I've actually built little custom bindings to do things like show these as tags, right? So this is my own little version of a people picker. If I start typing there, you know, it's more of an auto suggest. These are coming from SharePoint groups, so I know who's in the groups. So it's a little bit simpler. I can do things like upload attachments. I have my own little attachment mechanism here. So I can do it, basically everything I would want to do with what their version of a task looks like from this one interface. So everything I'm doing is automatically being written back to the list. On every field change, not item, you know, there's no save button. It's an automatic write because I've got the logic built that way. And it's also refreshing every 5 minutes. So if somebody else is working on the tasks, I actually see those changes as well. I can look at they actually are calling their task projects because they find the word task demeaning. Yeah, but like you still have to do it, right? So I actually built it so that projects is a variable. The value there is a variable. It's in that config list because some teams actually don't mind calling it tasks. It's a weird company. So this is a much more complicated version of what sort of example of what you can do with Knockout. I can build, you know, I can add new ones. I can basically do everything I'd want to do with a task list from this page without ever leaving. So it's a single page application in my mind, but it's not a multi-page, single page application, if that makes sense. And then one last one. This is also a real thing. This is the development environment for an application that we built on top of, I built with a client on top of SharePoint. It's on top of SharePoint, but it doesn't look like SharePoint. We have no SharePoint Chrome in this. We're basically using SharePoint as the back end. And what this is for residents in a medical program, the preceptors, the people who manage the residents, to take notes on the residents' performance. One would hope that that happens in a teaching hospital, right? So they actually don't have very good mechanisms for this. So we can do some really fancy stuff. And I'm only showing this to you just to show you how incredibly complicated you can make things with Knockout. This page will take a second to load. Still working on the performance of it. But we're using some jQuery UI accordions here. These are individual field notes. So Bill did something one day and they wrote this field note on them. We're using jQuery UI sliders here. I've built custom bindings around all of this so that, and I didn't get into that because it's more of an advanced thing, but I can actually build very complicated pages like this and again, sort of once we got to this level, making changes like, could we make this thing blue, or can we move it over like that, or switch the way the labeling works? It's a very quick change at that point. So you can go pretty far with Knockout. I really like Knockout. It makes sense to me. I think making the change between Knockout and Angular would probably not be too hard. But again, match the platform or the tool to the business requirements. So that's that. I'm over by a minute. Thanks for coming. Hopefully this was helpful.